Uh, Hello. I have been asked by my nephew, Matan Norsi, the son of my cousin, to give a little bit of stories of my life. And I have many, many stories. But let's start with the first story. When I came in the world in Genova, 1927, May 29, the son of Emma Veroli, an Italian Genovese family, and Leon Haim, and his Hebrew name was Judah. Lion. Lion is Judah. He was from Smyrna, Turkey, and met my mother in Genoa at the uh, invitation to the Veroli family for Pesach. On a Pesach night, he met my mother. They went out a few times, and then I think a year later they married. Anyway, the salient points of my life, beside the day that I saluted Mussolini as a Balilla when he came to visit Genoa, and I never forgive myself for saluting him. The salient life points were everybody's laughing at me because I put a piece of chewing gum to close the tooth empty in my mouth because I had a pulled tooth 5 days ago. But all the other teeth are good. Anyway, one of the significant happenings of my life was in 1938 when the edict against the Jews in Italy prohibited the students to continue their studies in the public school. I had just been admitted to the gymnasium after the school after the elementary school, and I was 12. And when I went to enroll in the Ginnasio Andrea Doria in Genoa, I was refused admission. At the time I didn't understand why, but more than to me, it affected my mother very deeply. And even though she was already very afraid of the future for the Jews in Genoa, this dismissal from the school infuriated her, and she said, "We have to leave Italy." Shortly thereafter, my father was warned that he might be in prison, so he left for France, and we were left there, my mother and I. All the family was advising us not to leave. They said, "No, it never could happen to us. Everything is fine. Stay, don't go away." But my mother said, "No, as far as I'm concerned, Italy is finished for the Jews." And even though my husband Leon wants us to go to France, to live in France, I maintain, she said, I maintain that Europe is finished for the Jews and we have to leave Europe. So from there, we went to Switzerland because we couldn't enter France at that moment. And wait just a minute. Shall I tell the story of how we went to Switzerland also? No.
Yes.
Okay. My mother, to explain our escape from Italy and to be admitted into Switzerland, made believe that we were going to Switzerland for winter sports. She bought skiing suits for herself and for me. She bought skates for herself and for me. And applied for a visa to go for winter sports in Switzerland. What is strange is that together with us, she brought two big sea trunks full of household goods, some carpets, and I don't know how at the frontier, two people coming for skiing had these two immense trunks with us. Anyway, we stayed in Switzerland for about 6 to 8 months. She put me in school, and I went to public school, waiting what to do and where to go. Finally, my father advised us that after a lot of searching, he was able to get a visa to go to Cuba. He had to pay the consul under the table, but he got a visa for Cuba. The question is was to enter France, because France was already becoming an enemy of Italy, and plus the fact that we were Jewish, we were not welcome to come in the country. However, we pushed the consul in Lausanne, where we were staying, Lausanne, Switzerland, and we were able to get a transit visa that would permit us to arrive in Bordeaux, where my father had booked the voyage to Cuba, the day before the departure of the trip. And we were not allowed to descend from the train, and we were told to go from the train to the hotel, from the hotel to the ship. Well, we arrived in Bordeaux in the midday, and it turns out that that day was the first night of Pesach. And when my mother, after we met my father at the hotel, said, "We have to have a Seder tonight." My father was not quite convinced of it. And anyway, I accompanied my mother. We went to the street looking for a butcher shop. She found one. She was able to buy a bone, then some greens, and the matzah that was given to us by the temple, who incidentally was not welcoming us, as the French Jews were afraid of immigrants. They already were feeling anti-Semitism in France, so any refugees that came into France were not welcome at all. Anyway, we did the shopping, went back to the hotel. I remember clearly the room was no more than 15 feet by 15 feet, with a big bed in the middle and some pillows for me to sleep on the side. She took out the cover to make a table out of the white sheets, which were not so white, and set out the matzah that we had gotten, the greens, and prepared to make the Seder. Now, what is very strange is that my father was not a religious man, and would never participate in prayers. However, the demands of the moment must have inspired him, because he was able to remember maybe 50% of the Haggadah. And between my father and mother, we went through the whole Haggadah with the benedictions, with the green, with the bone, and all this done in a cheerful way. And I cannot understand how my father and mother could have carried that cheerfulness for the Pesach at a moment like this, unless they were thinking that this was again the time of Moses and we were going away and crossing the waters. We had that Seder, and I noticed my mother taking the hametz, fikoman, the middle matzah, and putting pieces, breaking it into pieces and putting it into a silk handkerchief and put it in her handbag. I asked her, "Why are you doing that?" She said, "You never know, you might need the
Afikoman.
Afikoman, I can't remember the name. So off with the next day we're on board. The Normandy was the name of the ship. No, not Normandy. Brittany. And off we go into the Atlantic. 1 or 2 days later, in the Atlantic, one of the biggest storms of the year, or many years, hit the Atlantic. And the ship was like a feather in the water. Nobody could move from cabin to cabin. No food was offered. And my mother opened the porthole, the window of the ship, which little water came in from the spray, and took part of the afikoman and threw it outside. And I was surprised. My father was afraid of what she was doing. And she said, "You never know, maybe this will help." And she closed the porthole. Believe it or not, about 5 hours, 6 hours later, the ship started to quiet down, the water started to quiet down, and we were in completely normal weather. So, let's stop for a minute. I am continuing. The ship was a French liner, a French ship, and when we were heading for Cuba, for Havana, a few days before landing, the ship was ordered to go to Martinique, an island in the Antilles belonging to France, because they wanted the ship to return to France quickly. We were offloaded in Martinique, and we were put, 500 or 600 refugees that were on the ship, most of them Jewish, from Poland, Hungary. We were the only Italians. And then there were also some Spanish refugees from the Spanish Revolution. In total about 500-600, and we were offloaded in Martinique and put on a small ship belonging to the French line that would take us to Cuba. Now, it turns out that that small ship was used to bring prisoners from France to the Cheyenne, Devil's Island. And they put a few hundred of us where usually 150 prisoners would be carried. So it turned out that we had to sleep 6 hours and then get up, and another person would come and sleep in the berth for 6 hours, 3 sleeping or 4 sleeping section during the day. But the trip from Martinique to Cuba was the best trip I ever took, because it stopped about 6 or 7 times in small islands, loading and unloading cargo. And I saw for the first time tropical islands, black people that I had never ever seen before, a jungle that came to the water. It was a wonderful trip. We were supposed to go to Havana, but for some reason they decided to offload us in Santiago, which is the large city on the opposite side of Cuba. And from there we were taken to Havana by truck. And I think it took a full day by truck driving. In Havana, we were refugees with hardly any money, and we were able to make out a living. My father associated himself with a Hungarian engineer, and they bought a garage, and together with a Cuban fellow, they never made a peso, because the Cuban partner took all the income and gave them nothing. But anyway, they were busy. In Cuba, I had my bar mitzvah. And my mother took a suit of my father and cut it down to my size. She cut it very close, like this. That looked like the first Eisenhower jacket that was ever made. I remember that clearly. And the bar mitzvah was held in a temple, a Sephardic temple, which was in the basement of a house. And when we went there, Shabbat, the day, and they took us down because we had not been there before, took us down to the basement, we saw the basement covered with sand. And we asked, why does it look like this with sand? And we were told that this was the old Sephardic way of praying to keep the sound and the noise quiet so that people around couldn't hear. And that's where I had my bar mitzvah. Okay, now from Cuba, we finally got a visa to come to the United States. It took about 2 years, not pleasant years, but for me pleasant, but not for my parents. So then we arrived in New York, and it was not pleasant. My father was already over 55 and had not a profession because he was a merchant in Italy. And my mother was able to get a job as a finisher for furs that put together small pieces of mink and made mink coats. And she was very well paid because it was a union job. My father tried so many things to do, but he was not successful. They didn't want to keep me in New York because it was a sad situation in those days to be in New York as a refugee. As a matter of fact, I joined the Young Men Jewish Association on 92nd Street and Lexington Avenue, and I noticed that I was not welcome among the young people, and I always wondered why. Instead of helping me and making me welcome, they would be so distant. And later on I realized that there was already a strong anti-Semitic movements in the United States. And the Jews, like the French Jews, were afraid that the incoming of refugees, Jewish refugees from Europe, would make the situation, the anti-Semitic situation in New York, in the United States, even worse. So I have to give an understanding to that period. Now, I think I will jump my education, which was not in New York, but in North Carolina, and it's a long story of how I got there. But then I'll jump to college, in City College, and then evening at Baruch College, another public school, public college in New York, until I was drafted at 18. And in my draft took me as a infantry training in Alabama, Anniston, Alabama. And in that training, I was the only Jewish person maybe in the camp, but certainly in my company. And half of the company was made up of Nisei, Japanese Americans. And can you imagine having bayonet practice with half a Japanese company facing you and you're going with them with the bayonet? But anyway, I distinguished myself in this training, and they put me capo squadra, head of the squad, but anyway. Then we were prepared to go to Japan because the war was over as occupational troop. And again, this is a side story, but an unusual story, that while we were crossing Panama Canal, the ship full of recruits going to Japan, in the middle of the night I was wakened and told to put everything in my knapsack and come on deck. I said, why me? He said, we don't know, come up on deck. I do put everything in, and I went on deck, and they said, you're getting off here. I said, why I'm getting off? You're getting off, we don't know. So immediately my mind said, oh, something happened at home. My father or mother died, and they're taking me back. God knows what's happening. And I see an ambulance on the ground waiting for me. I said, the ambulance was something terrible. I go down in the ambulance. I said, where are we going? He says, we're going back to the Atlantic side of the canal. I have to take you there. Why is it? I don't know. He says, it's an airfield. It's the 8th Army Air Force airfield on the Atlantic side. So I go, we travel most of the night. In the morning we arrive at France Field, and we stop in front of the clinic with the Red Cross, and I'm still saying, France Field, airplane, we're going back to New York. Waiting for me was the captain, medical corps, Captain Cavan, I still remember his name. And he rushed to me and saluted me and then offered his hand and made me welcome. I said, oh, he's being sorry for me, he's trying to cheer me up. And he says, oh, I'm so happy to finally have a pharmacist here. I said, what? He says, aren't you a pharmacist? He says, I'm here for 6 months without a pharmacist. They said they pulled out a pharmacist from the ship. So I said, I worked in a pharmacy. I said, but I'm not a pharmacist. Oh my God, what happened? So maybe I have to send you back to the Panama on the other side of the hospital for quarantine, because when you arrive in Panama, you have to quarantine for health purposes. And then he said, but I hate to send you to that hospital. Maybe I keep you here for quarantine, and then you can go on. So he takes me into the X-ray room. He puts some blankets on the X-ray table. He says, you're going to be here for 3 or 4 weeks. We bring you the food to the door. And at night, without saying anything, you can walk around and move. But during the day, you're stuck here. Anyway, to make it short, in the 3 weeks, I found a manual of pharmacists. I studied the manual. When my quarantine was over, I became a full pharmacist, took over the pharmacy, and lived there for a year. He made me a private first class after 1 month. He made me a corporal after another month. And after 2 more months, he made me a sergeant, technical sergeant. This was all in the space of 3 months. And then he asked me, Jack, would you like to be on flight pay? I said, flight pay? That means an increase of income of 30–40%. He said, but I don't fly. He said, you don't have to fly. He says, once every 2 weeks, you have to go up 2 hours, 3 hours with somebody and drop some medicine in the jungle where we have some settlements, some guard posts. So here I was in Panama, a sergeant on flight pay, and a jeep and an ambulance available to me every evening to go out with my friends and have a good time outside in the canal. My Spanish which I had gotten in Cuba, came in very handy. Okay, we stopped for a minute. Hello again. Back in New York, after my war service in Panama, I finished school. I went back to the pharmacy where I used to work as a delivery boy and then use compounds. I worked behind the counter and I was very close to the owner. The owner was able to get me admitted to pharmacy school, Columbia College of Pharmacy, which was very difficult because all the returning veterans had the GI Bill of Rights. The government paid for the education in the university. I was in Columbia, graduated as a pharmacist, and had to leave the small pharmacy where I had worked and went to work into a large, not pharmacy, but drugstore. And if you know America, you know that drugstores sell everything except braziers, but they sell candies, cosmetic, cameras, a whole thing. Speaking Spanish, and the drugstore was in a hotel, I was on commission, and I made more on commission than the pay as a pharmacist. But I was very unhappy there. And one day, for good reason, I walked out. I hung up my white jacket, I said goodbye, and I left. During this period, and my father knowing that I was not happy working in a drugstore, wrote letters without telling me in an old Underwood typewriter that we had brought from Italy in those big trunks, and wrote to companies offering my services, knowing that I know language, that I was graduated pharmacy school, and one of those letters fell into the hand of a brokerage house. Schmidt, Schoenwald, and Turner was the brokerage house that specialized in chemicals and pharmaceuticals. Someone wrote back to me that they knew maybe they could help me. I rushed down to this company, and a lady who wrote that letter said to me, "I like your letter," she says. "I don't think the typewriter was so good," she says, "but I like your letter. I think there's a company that's looking for a trainee." And the name of the company is Biddle Sawyer Corporation. It sounded a good Biddle Sawyer, fancy. So I rushed from that brokerage house directly, by taxi, which I had never taken, to this company. And who do I meet there? A fellow by the name of Wallace Chafkin, the manager of the chemical export-import department. He let me talk. He asked me what I was doing, and I told him, "Look, I'm working in a pharmacy. How much are you making?" He said, "I'm making $90 plus commission of $100. Oh, he says, "You're making too much money." He said, "I can only pay $50, $60 a week." I said, "I'll take it." He looked at me, he said, "Well, how can you be doing that?" I said, "Look, for me to work in export-import and to have the chance to use my languages, to travel, is worth everything." He said, "You don't like pharmacy?" I said, "No, not I like pharmacy, but I don't like the drugstore." He says, "You know, it's very strange. Where did you go to school?" I said, "Columbia College of Pharmacy." He says, "I went to Columbia College of Pharmacy." "Oh," he says, "I worked in my father's drugstore, and I hated it. And I left that job, and here I am, I'm the manager of this department." He was 5 years older than me, not much older, 6. So he says, "You like it?" I said, "I'll take the job." He said, "Okay, you can start next week." It was Christmas, between Christmas and New Year. When I went back to my father and told him the story, first I said, "How can you write letters without telling me?" He said, "Well, look, it was successful." Okay. So he says, "I want to meet this man." I said, why? He said, look, I wrote the letter, you got the job, I want to meet this man. So I called him up, we had lunch. And the lunch went very well. My father knew how to talk to everybody. And as we're going out of the restaurant, and Chavkin is a few steps ahead of us, my father brings me close to him and he says, Jack, this man is a prince. That's after meeting him for lunch. He says, this man is a prince. One day you will be partner with him. I said, what? You'll see. So we went back to the office, they shook hands, goodbye. Anyway, to start to cut the story down, I started as a trainee. I think it was $60 a week. After 2 weeks, he increased me to $200 a week. After 6 months that I was there, I was making $10,000 a year, which in those days is like $150,000 today. No, not 150, but 80 or 90. And this, with this man, Wally Chavkin, we remained partners for 40 years. And I rose to be a partner with him. We established our own company. We left the old company. We established our own company. We took as a partner his younger brother. We took as a partner a refugee from Egypt by the name of Benveniste. And we had a beautiful career in export-import business, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, botanicals, aromatic chemicals. So that's the end of that part of the story. Now then, what is it? Oh, before, in 1957, and my social life was very fulfilled because I had met a stewardess for Pan American, and after meeting her, I met colleagues of her, and in that ambiance, it was quite acceptable to have more than one girlfriend. So there was one Pan American, another from Japanese airline, another one from another airline, and I was quite satisfied. However, my parents were becoming a little concerned about my social life, and they wanted me to settle down. My father, during this month, had on his desk a photograph of a very good-looking girl in a bathing suit